Hey everybody, welcome back to Jägerhorn. Today's episode is very different from the last episode in that I'm kind of all over the place. There's not a singular build like the station build of the last episode that I'm working on, but rather I'm doing all kinds of things around the park, trying to bring everything together and tie up the loose ends by doing all sorts of foliage work, path work, small scenery items and some larger scenery elements like a small snack shop. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. So I wanted to start this episode off with something that you probably know by now is a bit of an obsession for me recently, and that is making custom lampposts. Especially for a theme like this, there aren't too many lampposts in the game to begin with, but there aren't really too many theme-specific lampposts. The ones that are there are quite generic and not very different, whereas I feel lampposts and similar details are some of the smallest but most important things to add an ambience to a certain area, to add to the atmosphere of the theme that you want to carry over with it. So in this case, since I want to go for an Alpine sort of Belle Epoque sort of theme, so it's all very Victorian, I wanted to go with some more Art Nouveau kind of lampposts. Something with a lot of ironwork, a lot of detailing. And because of that, there really isn't anything like that in the game, and I had to make something myself. So this is basically the result. I'm actually not making this for the first time in this recording. I'm trying to remake it from the lampposts that I made earlier while not recording, because trying to come up with a design for these was very messy and very much a process of trial and error, especially texture-wise, since there aren't really exactly any metal elements that you can use to build these ironwork detailings with. So instead you sort of have to look for certain things that have that similar texture and which you can make similarly dark and which you can put together in sort of strange ways to make it look as though it's actually decorative ironwork. So that's that lamppost. There are a few lamps on it to make it seem a little bit larger than the in-game lampposts. It's definitely a little bit larger than human scale, so I won't be using it too much. It's really just an element that I want to put in some of the most grandiose sightlines of the park. But then again, that's also for me a bit of a point, especially when it comes to pathworks, and this is something you might also know by now. I really like to switch up stuff, so I don't want to use the same fences all over the park. I definitely think it's much more fun and much better to use all kinds of different fences, even within a single area. And I think the same goes for lampposts. So I really want to use all kinds of different lampposts and use different kinds of lampposts in different areas. So for example, this one will be used more alongside the larger boulevard, along with this small fence that I'm actually making for it. This is sort of a set that goes together. So yeah, I'm placing it here alongside this somewhat large boulevard that'll be alongside the restaurant and really be one of the major sightlines of the park. But for some of the less important paths, I'll just be getting to some simple wooden lights that are much more drawn back, don't really draw as much attention as these lampposts, and would just be a lot cheaper as well. And those are the things that I'm getting to right now. So that was actually a pretty good accidental segue. One little trick that I think is quite neat that you can use with some of these Christmas detailings, which you just saw me do in a second there, is you can put together these 2D gingerbread decorations and put them together very close together, like there's only a little bit of air between them, and then put a bunch of them next to each other so it actually looks as though they are 3D, which is something that you could normally do with 2D alpha textures, and something which I don't think any object in the game does, although I definitely don't have enough of an understanding to know. But you can basically put together a bunch of these 2D objects very close to each other to sort of make them look 3D. So I think that's a pretty neat trick. Also, I put some billboard scenery items, like the billboard mounts that you have, into the wooden planks over there to sort of make it look as though the wooden plank is actually hammered onto the wooden posts of the lamp. So I think that object actually works quite well for making those nails, and I think it kind of makes the look of that particular lamppost a little bit stronger, because you can use it in quite a few themes. Sometimes you'll just see these lampposts where you can very clearly tell that there's just one diagonal plank sort of stuck to the other posts that the lamppost is made out of. and you can just see the nails and everything. Sometimes they'll use ropes to connect them, but in any case it's sort of lo-fi lamps that are a bit, you know, they're a bit sort of not entirely well put together. They're sort of made to look a bit rickety like that, and that's the sort of look that I wanted to go for with these lamps as well. And the great thing about having 3 different lamps instead of just making one is that you can sort of have some very small variations along the park, and every path has a slightly different lamppost. I just now realized that you probably shouldn't be starting drinking games with me saying the word lamppost in this episode. So this thing right here is a park map. I know it doesn't look like one. It'll probably still be quite a while until I have something that's good enough to actually put a park map in there. But the idea is that this would be a pretty good place to place a park map. It's really a place where a lot of things come together. And even if that doesn't work out, I think you could even make it into a queue time sort of billboard. I haven't actually seen those too much, but I was at Phantasialand recently, and even though Phantasialand has the worst internet reception ever, like, I was supposed to meet up with a few guys in Phantasialand, and I've actually been strolling around the park for an hour on my own because I couldn't get internet anywhere. Eventually found one lonely corner in the park with reception that was literally, not even kidding, the most dead part of the park with no ride. But yeah, that aside, they have no connection, no internet, so you're completely internetless in Phantasialand. At least I was. But what they do have is these boards that tell you all the queue times. Like, they don't have an app, they don't really have internet, so it's not that high-tech as many parks will have. But they do have those very neat boards which show you all the queue times for all the coasters, which is something that's actually quite cool about the park. And they're even sort of little meeting spaces. Like, they're placed at some of the most busy and important interchanges of the paths around the park. But you can really see just groups of people grouping together around those big announcement boards to actually see what the queue times are and where they should go next, which is quite handy, especially since they're sort of at forks on the road, so you can still use them as a way to sort of decide your way around the park. So yeah, whatever is going to happen with that billboard, I thought that is a very important point where we want to have something like that. So I just put that in there for future use, whatever we're going to do with it eventually. Now over here is a little bit of regular pathwork, just putting rocks and lampposts everywhere to make everything seem a little bit more alive. I'm very afraid of creating a large open space with these paths, especially considering how vast these paths are, and there isn't really anything that I can put in the middle of these. So I'm trying as much as I can to use all of these trees and all of the planters in order to sort of break up the paths and give this park more of a forest look to it. So moving on, and this is one of my favorite things of the episode, one of my favorite things of the entire park actually so far. This is a small stall for fries, that's pretty much it. It's just a little building. It was inspired by one of the buildings in Planet Brocoaster actually. I'm sorry, I need to shout out Planet Brocoaster once again. I don't know how many times this has happened already, but I was just strolling around their park looking for stuff, just looking around, because it's just fun to look around in the park and just sort of pretend that it's real, and then it isn't real, and it kind of sucks because you're in a video game. But in any case, I was just walking around the park and saw this building, and it's just a tiny little building. It was slightly offset, it's a little bit messy, it has loose planks and loose rocks, but it was really charming, and I figured I wanted something like that, just a little bit bigger and more suited to the theme of Jägerhorn. But something like that I figured would be quite good for this theme, especially since we have this large plaza over here that doesn't really have any buildings or anything of attention other than the vista that you have of the coaster. So I thought this was a perfect place to put some kind of small building, which you can go to and do something with, some kind of interaction with the scenery. So this is a small building that sells fries. And that's really just about it. It's a little bit of a messy building, to be honest, since it is inspired by that sort of thing, but at the same time I did want to bring back some of the ideas of the Swiss chalet style that you see in the station and the church. So there is a little bit of that gable decoration that you see, and it's quite a detailed building actually. I ended up taking quite some time to stick all of the wooden posts and planks together into this building to shape out all the little details that make this very simple and rustic, but I think it's a pretty charming building in the end. It's nothing big, it definitely doesn't want to draw attention to itself, it's really just there to add to the surroundings instead of drawing attention from the surroundings to the building itself. But I think it's important to have stuff like this around in your parks. Even just from a functional perspective, there wasn't really any place to eat yet, and even though there will be a restaurant very close to this, you know, very often you don't really want to sit down in a restaurant, you just want to quickly pick up some fries and maybe spend like 10 minutes eating them at max and then just hop into the next ride. So something that can serve you really quickly and get you on your way to riding more coasters is something that this area really needed, I think. So when it comes to the general detailing, it's very similar on the front side as compared to the back side. The only problem was it's a slightly offset building, like the right side goes down a little bit more, which I partly did to make it look interesting, but partly just to fit that billboard in there that says that this is the Monsieur Fritz, or excuse my French pronunciation, that this is, you know, the place where you can get fries. I want to have as much space for advertising in the end, after all, since, you know, this is a theme park, we need to make money. So I do have that in there, but I think it does add to the building quite a bit. And next to this I had a bit of grass, and I figured it would be a better idea to fill this up with a bit of theming to create the sort of atmosphere of having a forest, rather than putting some paths over here or turning this into one big seating area. Because ideally I don't want to turn this into an area where you're gonna sit. This is really a path from which you'll be walking toward Jägerhorn, because from this direction you do have probably one of the best sight lines toward the church and the coaster itself, so I really wanted to use this as a path where people don't do anything but walk toward Jägerhorn and see Jägerhorn in the distance. But when you're standing in line for this stall, if there is a line at all, you also have a really good view of the church. But it does break it up a little bit, which I guess is interesting as well. If you're walking toward Jägerhorn, you'll see this tiny building standing between you and Jägerhorn, and I think it's an uninteresting looking building, enough to the point where it doesn't really draw your attention away from the scene that you're supposed to look at, being the coaster itself, but it does sort of give you this reference point in front of it, so you do have some interesting perspective play, I think. Like you'll see the this very small building with some trees and decorations around it in the front, and then in the back you'll see the hill sort of loom in the distance high up, which isn't actually really all that high, but since the church building is on a small scale and this building is actually on a human scale, and there's this big gap between these paths and the mountain itself, where there's this little valley that the coaster goes through, I think everything looks quite a bit larger, and the force perspective does come into play a bit. It's making it actually look as though you're walking toward a mountain. Now over here, I'm just doing some very simple foliage. Simple to the point where I didn't want to keep the valley itself completely foliageless and just put some grass in there, because I really wanted to have that to keep the view intact and still make it look as though the mountain is bigger than it really is. But at the same time, I did want to have some foliage and decoration alongside the path, so there's this sort of row of small trees and bushes going alongside the path, going alongside the boulevard and the fences and the lamps. But it isn't really that much. There's still the grass behind it, and you can still have a perfect clear view of the mountain and the roller coaster behind it as well. It's actually, this is a pretty funny thing actually. I recently listened to a podcast with, God, I forgot his name. I'll look him up in the meantime, but I recently listened to a podcast with the designer of Phantasialand, or at least somebody who played a huge role in the design of Black Mamba, in the design of Chappas, and even the design of Klugheim recently. And funnily enough, he himself, oh right, there we go, his name was Eric Damon, and he's from Belgium, and funnily enough, he himself was kind of afraid of roller coasters. Like at the time of listening to that podcast, he hadn't even written Black Mamba yet, ever. But I thought what was really interesting about his way of designing, and something that I think I can even sort of see back with myself, since for a long time I was afraid of roller coasters as well, is designing coasters for the people who don't ride them instead of designing them for the people who do ride them. So what you'll see with many of the rides at Phantasialand is that the roller coasters have so many paths going around them and going through their areas, with all kinds of places where you can stand or sit and just look at the coaster, that, you know, it's almost more of an experience to look at the coaster than to just ride it. And the people who don't dare to go on the coaster have a really good interaction with the coaster that way as well. I actually feel this way about Baron 1898. I almost enjoy it more to look at that coaster than to ride it. Although that's kind of because it's not that intense, but still, it's something that I want to keep in mind with my projects as much as I can as well. So I always try to design coasters for the people who are not going to ride it. And I think the same goes for Jägerhorn as well. Even though it's a family ride, not everybody is going to get on it, even if it still applies to the largest demographic that you can. So there are plenty of benches and plenty of paths where you have a lot of interaction with the ride itself. And I want to keep those as clear as possible. Like, simultaneously I want to make the area look as forested as possible and place as many trees as I can, but at the same time I don't want to break open the sight lines between the paths and the coasters. So actually tree placement is something that I'm super careful about, and something that I can take a lot of time actually, just very slightly moving trees and then moving the camera to see how it looks and getting the exact placement where you can use the tree to get the foresty atmosphere from it, but at the same time not break up the sight lines that you want to keep intact. So yeah, that's something that you'll see me do quite a bit in Jägerhorn as well, and it's definitely something that comes back with the idea of having that boulevard sort of run alongside the valley that the coaster goes through, with a restaurant and that stall for fries, but also this path bridge going over the coaster, and having just these very simple fences alongside the side. I know these fences probably wouldn't have done it in the US. This was actually something that I came to realize only recently, when some Americans were very surprised at how small the fences around Phantasialand are, and how they're all just themed instead of huge metal fences that completely prevent you from coming very close to the coasters. Like, you can almost touch terrain and it's not that hard to get out of the path and actually go into that area. Even though you should never do it, I personally like it when theme parks keep their coasters as open as possible. Like, when you can come close enough that you do feel as though you're not, you know, as though they're not keeping you away from the coaster, even when it's still safe. So yeah, we're just using some simple fences that, you know, wouldn't 100% keep you out of it, but it will just make it pretty clear, you know, you're not supposed to jump into the area of the coaster, and it's still kind of hard to do it, but your view of the coaster isn't really obstructed, and the fences are there to add to the theme, rather than being huge metal fences that only subtract from the theme itself. And to that end, I'm also keeping all of the foliage around this area quite low and quite simple, so you can still look at the coaster, and you can see the paths from the coaster itself as well. And I was actually really happy to start theming this area, because this is the first sort of non-mountain area. We've got the very clear divide on the coaster between the mountain area, which is up quite high, and the second part of the coaster where it just sort of dips through these lower valleys, and where it has more interaction with the station and the queues and the rest of its track. So this was sort of the first part of the latter part of the ride, and even though it's still part of the first part of the ride, but it's where it sort of dips into the other side. So this was a bit of an experiment to see, like, to what extent I could get the Alpine look into the surroundings of the coaster without completely breaking open the sightlines, because this is a very important part of the environment here, and something that I really wanted to keep as open as possible, since right here is where pretty much all the paths look at the station building, and also where from another path you can see the mountain of Jägerhorn as well, alongside the coaster station and the coaster track. So I wanted to keep this open, keep all the foliage very low, and keep as much grass as I could over here. So I'm sort of experimenting to see how all of that is going to look. Also, this is where I experimented for a little bit, making a small stone path using these pillar pieces. Now for a while I sort of messed up and just used square pieces, but at some point I realized I can actually sort of use the terrain in your advantage, since you can very slightly slide certain pieces to the part where they're invisible and give them different shapes other than squares, which can actually give you a pretty convincing stone path look, I think, even though they're quite small stones and they don't really have any difference in texture. And even if there is, they're very slight differences. I think it's something that at least sells the look of it quite a bit. And this is actually where I'm going a little bit far in trying to theme everything, because this path is obviously not really supposed to be used by anybody. It's just for evacuation purposes. If the train could stall in that little valley of the curve right there, which to be honest it could actually, then this is the path that you're going to want to take all of the people out of the coaster, which is pretty quick, but I still wanted to theme it as much as we can. So again, we have the path being made by the fountains with a very fitting texture, I think, for the surroundings. There is a small stone path, a small sort of wooden bridge over the track itself, and also that little wooden door, which I guess people could very easily use to get into the coaster area, but hey, that's something I'm not going to be worried about too much. Honestly, my personal view is just that you shouldn't be too ridiculous about safety around roller coasters, and you know, just leave it open to common sense. Nobody is going to walk onto a roller coaster track. But then again, how are you going to stop people completely from doing that, and who's going to stop them from filing lawsuits when something does go wrong? That's probably not something I want to get into too far, but God, I just like it when parks just, you know, leave you be and don't completely stop you from going everywhere, and just, you know, let you down to your own common sense of not going into the ride areas. Because that's just how it should be. Now, I'm just doing a little bit of extra clutter over here by ending my ever favorite piece, that water well. I think I can hardly stop myself from ending that whenever the theme allows. It's just one of those very small things that you can just put in anywhere. And over here I'm doing my best to take the bro basics foliage tutorial in there and get some nature in, I should say, which if you still haven't seen it, this is something that I should totally still link in this video, even though I've shouted it out already and talked about it in multiple videos. The bro basics about nature is an amazing Planet Coaster episode about doing foliage in different ways, whether you're going for completely natural foliage, completely man-made foliage, or the thing that sits sort of in between and is the man-made sort of planted foliage with all kinds of arrangements of bushes and trees that is clearly man-made but looks as if it's sort of natural. It's trying to look natural, and that's something which really comes back quite a lot in Jägerhorn, because obviously all of these arrangements of bushes and everything is planted there and it's definitely not natural, but at the same time it's trying to look like it's nature. I'm trying to fit the look of a whole large forest and mountain area into a few square meters everywhere, so it's sort of hyper condensed into that small version. I'm not entirely sure how much I like certain parts, like I'm really keeping the palettes very restricted. I'm only using a lot of dark colors and using just a few of the foliage items that we have in Planet Coaster, and trying to avoid all of the more tropical and light shrubs. But so far, I'm actually pretty happy with it. So yeah, we'll see how far we could take this, and maybe if in the future we'll have some more foliage into the game that can fit into this area. So here I'm just getting to some more path elements, and I think this is the last sort of main thing that I'm getting to in this episode. I already wanted to get a signpost into this square here, since it's probably the most important meeting point of different paths in the park, and also the one where you're gonna have to direct the guests into the area where they can actually get into the coaster. Because nothing is worse than walking around an attraction with all these beautiful paths but having no idea where the queue actually starts. And also directing the guests toward the restaurant and the exit of the park, all that sort of stuff. And also here I wanted to get into using some slightly different borders around these paths. I'm not entirely sure yet what I'm going to do with these paths. For the longest time I've sort of promised myself that I'm going to build buildings next to these, but yeah, that would take a lot of time to do, so that's my only thing sort of stopping me from really deciding for good that I'm gonna do something like that. But for now, I'm pretty fine with just leaving this with foliage and some simple path curbs and other elements. Also a bench that you can sit on, because I love it, where you could just have that wall that people can actually sit on. I think the bench texture, that wooden bench texture, actually adds quite a lot to the wall, but it also quite like adds something to the game, I feel, when people actually sit on a wall. Because to be honest, that's kind of what people do. If you're in a theme park and you've been walking around for all day, like literally I will sit on anything. I'll sit on queue railings all the time, and whenever there's a flat surface that's anywhere between 50 centimeters and a meter tall, I'll sit on it for sure. So I just love it when people sit on random things, and when you can get the guests to sit on random things that might not look... Sorry. I might have actually said that I still have a cold. I don't think I have yet, so here goes. I still have a cold, and I'm trying to one-take wonder this recording. So I'm sorry about that, but yeah. Basically, people will sit on anything in the theme park. That's the message. Especially if you're me. Maybe I shouldn't project my feelings onto everybody else, but I'm pretty sure that many people are gonna sit on many different things and get very creative to be able to sit anywhere. So, yeah, with just a little bit of clutter left, with some simple barrels and boxes around the restaurant, or the fry stall I should say, I'm ending up this episode, and that has been it for this episode of Jägerhorn. So thank you guys for watching, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next episode, in which I'm not sure what I'm working on, but it's probably going to be the queue. So yeah, bye guys, see you later.